BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be discussing the book The Autobiography of Jack the Ripper by James Carnac, responding to the writings of Patricia Cornwell, and of course continuing the discussions with the Ripper cast. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. Firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to the recent two-part interview that I did with Dr. Chad Galuska, and we were talking about all things Jack the Ripper related. The interview came out for the last 2 weeks of Ripper Wednesday, and there's also a new video on the Jack the Ripper Tour YouTube channel that was made by Richard Jones that is discussing the 1902 Lambeth Horror. Some very interesting stuff. And in this episode, I'm going to be making one that I've wanted to do for quite some time. I've wanted to talk to you guys about the book, The Autobiography of Jack the Ripper by James Carnac. This is a book that really surprised me because last year in December, I was looking at the books that I was going to read about Jack the Ripper for the next year. And the one that was at the top of my list was The Autobiography of Jack the Ripper. And the reason why is because I'm just absolutely fascinated about how and why people choose to portray Jack the Ripper as a character. I'm curious how people examine the Ripper's thought process. What was the Ripper thinking when he committed the crimes? What was the Ripper doing before the Whitechapel murders? What was he doing afterwards? When I found out that there was this book called The Autobiography of Jack the Ripper, I knew that I had to read it. But, as we're going to see, this is something that really surprised me because it's not a novel. It's not presented as a novel. It's presented as an actual historical relic, as someone who claims that they were Jack the Ripper using the name James Willoughby Carnac. And I'm even just going to read the description for you right here. This gripping account takes us on a journey through the twisted psyche of Jack the Ripper, showcasing his sinister motives and meticulous planning. Ultimately, you, the reader, must decide if this is simply one of the earliest historical fiction imaginings of the case and a groundbreaking literary addition to the Ripper canon, or is it the genuine autobiography of Jack the Ripper himself? And I was really quite surprised once I learned that this is actually somebody pretending or claiming to be Jack the Ripper. So I put it back on the bookshelf for quite some time because I didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't know necessarily how to approach it. I thought that this was going to be a book that was somewhat in line with Stephen Hunter's I, Ripper, where again someone's trying to recreate the thought process of Jack the Ripper when he committed the murders. But it appears that this is something that we really are expected to think may have come from the Ripper. And I don't know about you, but I was just thinking, well, then, who was James Willoughby Carnac, and could he have actually been Jack the Ripper? Let's go through some things here in this episode. And in the book, The Autobiography of Jack the Ripper, there is an appendix that was written by Paul Begg. Perhaps we can say an essay has been included in this book about Paul Begg and his experience with the manuscript for the autobiography of Jack the Ripper. This manuscript was found among the effects of a man who died in the early 1930s. In a brief introduction called Explanatory Remarks, he claims to have known James Carnac and been appointed his executor, and that he had received the manuscript along with Carnac's effects. It was in a sealed packet and attached to the exterior, and there was a letter that was addressed to him in which Carnac asked that it be sent to a specified literary agent, who were rare beasts back then, Fearing that compliance with this request might create problems with probate authorities, the man opened the package and read the contents. Some particularly revolting material was apparently removed, but otherwise it was intended that the manuscript be presented to the literary agents as requested. Whether this was actually done and the manuscript was returned, or whether something stopped Carnac's wishes being complied with, is unknown. Was this story even remotely true? Or is this the author's explanatory remarks? And was this supposed friend and executor of James Willoughby Carnac the real author of the whole manuscript, using the well-established literary device of claiming to having been a bequest to give his narrative some familiarity? If so, might he have been Jack the Ripper? Fortunately, he could not unless Jack the Ripper was a babe in arms. Yes, that's how it is phrased right there. Okay, though, so my immediate response is that that's one of the reasons why I kept this thing on the bookshelf for months, because I was just thinking, well, is this all just a giant scam? Is this all just a giant hoax? Or which parts of the stories could be a scam? Which parts of the stories could be a hoax? Did somebody actually have this book, and were they trying to comply with the wishes of someone? Or did that person fabricate the manuscript? Was this all just a giant plot for somebody to write a novel and try and pass it off as being a Jack the Ripper memoir, or as the title says, autobiography? So because of these unclear issues, I was just so hesitant to explore this material. Again, I felt that my thought process was just going in so many different directions. But let's keep going here with the writings of Paul Begg. On the face of it, it is as likely as Elvis living on Mars. The man who wrote the introduction was Sidney George Hume Beeman, a sometime actor and also a distinctive illustrator. So it seems like Paul Begg is taking the stance that he is not going to think that the autobiography of Jack the Ripper is authentic, and that this could be a 20th century hoax. I repeat, not a 19th century hoax, but a 20th century one. Another thing that I have noticed is that I've been doing the Ripper Wednesday segment here on Black Box Online Radio for about 3 years now, and not once has anybody ever written into the show and said, oh, my suspect is named James Carnac, or I read the autobiography of Jack the Ripper by James Carnac, and I'm convinced by this story. Absolutely not. And I noticed that the news coverage that was surrounding this publication was almost all from 2012. And a lot of people wonder, well, why is it that certain stories come in and out? Why is it that certain stories get mentioned and then briefly forgotten? I think that they just have periods of media exposure, and then they just fade away into irrelevance. Because last week on the channel, I was talking about the Jack the Ripper suspect, Francis Craig, and a lot of people in the comments section were saying that they had never heard of Francis Craig. And I have an episode about him. His name was Francis Spurzheim Craig, and he is the subject of the book Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story by Wynne Weston Davies. And perhaps the reason why he isn't more widely discussed is all the news coverage that I could find about him was from 2015. It seems like he was a new suspect, brought on the radar, or I shouldn't say a new suspect, but he was brought on the radar and popularized in 2015 because of the Wynne Weston Davies books. And then not much ever came of it. But there's actually an article that was written about James Carnac on the History Channel's website, and this came out on January 19th of 2012, written by Jenny Cohen, just citing the source. Typed on yellow pages, with a handmade cover, the manuscript that inspired the new book comes from an unlikely source, Sidney George Hume Beeman, the British author and illustrator who created Toy Town. Beeman wrote in the preface that a one-legged acquaintance named James Carnac, whom he described as having a streak of cynical and macabre humor, bequeathed the document to him in the 1920s, and he asked that it be published after his death. Beeman also claimed to have omitted certain particularly revolting passages from the original text. Well, that should be an absolute no-go right there, and does that not just raise suspicions for you in some ways? Now, if somebody has this book where they're claiming to be Jack the Ripper, why on earth would you omit anything? Because at that point, it's not just a book. If you actually think that this is the real writings of Jack the Ripper, what right does anybody have to omit something from it? Did Beeman himself pen the alleged autobiography? This person is in line with the thinking of Paul Begg, using a centuries-old literary convention in which a writer presents a fictional memoir as a found document. It's hard to believe that the man who came forward for the famous Larry the Lamb character would reconstruct grisly crime scenes in his spare time. Well, now, wait a second. We also have to remember that we're all still human, and somebody can be interested in more than one thing. And just because somebody is creating children's stories, it doesn't mean that they're going to be completely afraid of things like Jack the Ripper. And in all seriousness, I don't think there is too much of a leap going from one literary device to a different literary device. Creating kid stories and creating adult stories, I think it's very possible for creative types. And let's keep going here with the History.com article. Forensic psychologist Richard Walter dismissed any link between Carnac and the real Ripper, maintaining that serial killers wouldn't document their crimes for posterity in a dramatic fashion. Well, this is going to raise so many issues because we have an even more famous story out there, and that's the Diary of Jack the Ripper that was allegedly written by James Maybrick, and I have a couple episodes about him here on this channel. Definitely one of the most famous Ripperological theories. And see, James Maybrick's story came on the scene well before 2012, and again, this book was written perhaps between 1928 and 1930, but it was popularized in 2012. But a big difference between James Maybrick and James Carnac is the James Maybrick story never went away. I mean, people to this day think that James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper, and I do get contacted by people saying, okay, I think that James Maybrick was the Ripper, here are the reasons why. With James Carnac, I mean, I think that he is mostly faded into obscurity. But as far as the forensic psychologist Richard Walter goes, I think that Richard Walter is somebody who is very hit or miss. I've talked about him a lot in the Zodiac world. I've explored his material, very, very intensely. Micro Deli was just on the new Zodiac killer show called The Chronicle, talking about Richard Walter. And there is also a case that Richard Walter is even more famous for, and that is the case of John Emile List. Richard Walter worked with a forensic artist named Frank Bender to create a bust of John Emile List that was very, very instrumental in catching the killer. Almost all of Richard Walter's observations about John Emile List were spot on. However, Richard Walter is also somebody who has been heavily criticized for misrepresenting his qualifications, for blatantly lying about his accomplishments, and there's a feature about him called The Fake Sherlock that is available in New York Magazine. But what do you think about this? One would not expect a serial killer to leave behind a manuscript detailing why they did the things. I mean, I know it seems unusual, but I wouldn't think that that's necessarily untrue. I mean, I wouldn't think that that's impossible. And furthermore, imagine if somebody were doing this and they weren't expecting to get caught. Imagine if somebody were doing this and they weren't expecting to go to jail. So I think that it's completely possible for a serial killer to write down a confession that they're leaving behind. That is one thing that we do see in the true crime world, deathbed confessions. But here's a quotation from Richard Walter about James Carnac. One would not expect a sadist, which Jack the Ripper was, to be self-disclosing. They are interested in creating a myth greater than what they are. They would not simply hand a book like that over to somebody who is probably going to exploit it. Walter added that, although he has only seen fragments of the manuscript, it seems to lack the cadence of violence typical of serial killers. Now that is another very important point, because even though, think about everything that I just said, serial killers do make confessions, right? Deathbed confessions, or they do it in the courtroom like BTK, and those are often really filled with violent language, violent imagery, violent stories. And if you do watch the BTK confession from Dennis Rader, he's extremely calm about it. He's almost enjoying recounting the details, but they are extremely violent. So if Richard Walter thinks that the language isn't violent enough, that's something to think about. Let's keep going here. Richard Walter added that although, jumping ahead, and that he also mentioned the long tradition of people impersonating the notorious murderer, which began with the hundreds of letters, nearly all deemed hoaxes, sent to Scotland Yard and signed Jack the Ripper during his deadly rampage. Okay, firstly, you guys might be thinking about something. Not all the Ripper letters were signed Jack the Ripper, most notably the From Hell letter, which was signed, Catch Me If You Can, Mr. Lusk, and as opposed to actually using the name Jack the Ripper. But in terms of this is a solid point, though. Other people pretended to have been Jack the Ripper. I think maybe only the previously mentioned Patricia Cornwell thinks that there were 200 letters written by the Whitechapel Fiend. Most people believe at some point somebody was hoaxing letters. Even if you think the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter were authentic, well, what about the Openshaw letter? What about the Moab and Midian letter? Are those authentic too? I think absolutely not. So that shows that it's not abnormal for people to try and impersonate a high-profile serial killer such as Jack the Ripper. So that means that probability is not on the side of this manuscript being true. Continuing, even assuming that James Carnac, whoever he was, should be added to the still growing list of proposed suspects, his book has a special place in the history of Jack the Ripper, and in Jack the Ripper literature, sometimes known as Ripperature. Ripperature, what a great word. Numerous novels and short stories based on the Whitechapel murders appeared in the late 19th and early 20th century. Okay, but here's a very big difference. Here is something that's very noticeable and very important about the differences, and that is that those things might be presented as novels. Those things might be presented as stories. This autobiography of Jack the Ripper was pretending to be the real thing, and somebody also brought this forward, claiming that it was either authentic or from someone who claimed that it was authentic. And for me, I just entered into an enormous gray area. I was like, well, what do I really say about this? Should I just dismiss it entirely as being some type of hoax? Should I just say, oh, well, I'm not going to talk about this because I don't know what it is? And ultimately, I decided that maybe that wasn't the best approach. Let's look at what's in the book. Let's look at what other people say about it. Let's look at some of the coverage. Let's look at some of the news articles that have been written about it. And if we're going to look at the news coverage, there's also a BBC article from January of 2012 as well, called Jack the Ripper Manuscript to be Published Worldwide. And perhaps one of the reasons why I have my copy of the autobiography of Jack the Ripper available on Kindle is because it was indeed published worldwide. Let's have a read here from the BBC. A manuscript possibly written by Victorian serial killer Jack the Ripper is to be published worldwide. The document was unearthed at the Montague TV and Radio Museum in Somerset in October of 2009 among the possessions of a children's author named S.G. Hilm Beeman. It is thought to have been written in the 1920s and is entitled The Autobiography of James Carnac. Ripper historian Paul Begg has read the whole manuscript and said it could not be dismissed as a piece of fiction, and you'll find all sorts of questions about its content and provenance. The manuscript is the first time the names James Willoughby Carnac has been linked to Jack the Ripper, although no public records have yet confirmed whether James Willoughby Carnac existed. That again was another reason why I had so much trouble trying to digest this story, because I'm just thinking, okay, well, this book says that James Carnac was Jack the Ripper. Well, who was James Carnac? And there's some things that we can gather about him, and perhaps I'll do a suspect profile episode on him in the future where I'm just listing off everything about James Willoughby Carnac. But in terms of this story, there's just so little to go on, and I really have to ask you that as a challenge question. Going back to the statements made by Richard Walter, do you believe that a serial killer would write his own autobiography and then leave it behind to be published? I mean, what do you think about that? Do you believe a serial killer would do that? Do you believe a serial killer would leave behind a diary and just confess to everything and even sign it with the name of the killer? The Diary of Jack the Ripper, the Autobiography of Jack the Ripper, and I'm fully aware the Autobiography of Jack the Ripper allegedly came first. Modern feel. Jack the Ripper killed and mutilated at least 5 prostitutes in London's East End in 1888. The autobiography of Jack the Ripper is divided into 3 parts, and they describe the real-life killings. The third part, according to Mr. Begg, is a very contrived, poor piece of fiction, and the first part talks about the early life of James Carnac. Paul Begg says that you have James Carnac suddenly saying that he is terrified of being burned alive, and that's why the Ripper reaches his end. But the first 2 parts seem to be written by someone else. So says Paul Begg. Well, I'm really curious to go through this book again with a fine-tooth comb, seeing what we can find. But at the same time, I also don't know if that is going to be the most valuable use of time and resources. Let's continue here. Paul Begg said the book was very interesting because it was also very modern, and that James Carnac is saying that he kills because he enjoys it, so it has a modern feel to it. Well, I'm not completely convinced as to the reason why Jack the Ripper killed the victims, and I would not dismiss that he was killing purely because he enjoyed it. Some people think that Jack the Ripper was losing control, that he had fits of mania, and he was just walking down the street. Like, he could walk, he could function, but he just had these urges where he was just on the verge of going berserk, and then he would just let it out around the women. So he's about, he's in control, actually. Let's say he's in control, but he has this itch that he cannot scratch, psychologically speaking. And then there are other people that think that Jack the Ripper was a cold, methodical, and calculating sadist. And it seems like if there's any truth to this, James Willoughby Carnac story, and any truth to this case for Jack the Ripper having this type of mindset, or Jack the Ripper writing the autobiography, they are presenting him as a cold, methodical, and calculating sadist. I'm not completely opposed to that. And also, the more that I read about criminal psychology and forensic psychology, it seems like the cold, methodical, and calculating sadist might actually be something that we're experiencing more frequently than someone who is just experiencing fits of mania and then returning to normalcy. So, let's keep going here. Mr. Begg said that he believed that the descriptions of the murders were not factually accurate, and doubted whether a serial killer would remember the time and dates or details of each murder years later. Oh, absolutely they do. Absolutely they do. I just brought up the BTK confession from Dennis Rader. If you watch that one, it is extremely detailed, and it's extremely methodical, and he just recalls all types of things that people are shocked about, and that's not an isolated incident. I mean, there are also other serial killers that have had similar experiences, and I've talked about some of them from true crime documentaries here on this channel, and one guy was just even refusing to share his stories because, you know, they were his own personal memories and so on. Absolutely. Serial killers can have very vivid memories, and I just remembered Samuel Little. He was the one that I was trying to think of. He perhaps murdered over 90 women, and he has an extremely powerful memory for recalling all of them. He can draw out their faces and tell the entire story. Yes, serial killers remember stuff like that. And also, I will share something with you guys. Long-term memories are created when emotion connects to information, and anger and rage are emotions. Let's keep going here. This is a quotation from Paul Begg. There's a throwaway remark where James Carnac is in the act of murdering the last victim, Mary Kelly, where he sees a reflection of himself in the mirror, and this has a profound effect on him. Well, I'm gonna bite my tongue for a second. I found one newspaper report from an American newspaper which referred to a mirror in Mary Kelly's room. It's interesting that it was found in a newspaper, and it plays a profound part in Carnac's account. So it seems like what Paul Begg is saying is that the person who wrote the autobiography of Jack the Ripper may have been looking at news sources from around the globe and trying to recreate this based on information that was publicly available. Now, one thing that I do indeed disagree about is that I don't think that Jack the Ripper would have been bothered by the sight of his own face in a mirror, where he's just going to look into the mirror and have a profound effect, because if somebody is a psychopathic sexual sadist, which I think Jack the Ripper was, then he's going to perhaps, if anything, have that fuel his own excitement. He's not just going to have this moment of clarity or this moment of empathy. Those types of behaviors and that type of thought process should not be present with a psychopathic sexual sadist. Psychopaths do not necessarily have that type of emotional self-awareness where they're like, oh no, I've done something bad. If somebody is like that, and then most likely they are not an actual psychopath. And to be clear, I'm not a psychologist, but I believe that Jack the Ripper was a psychopath. I believe he was a sadist. And I also think that he showed no regard for the women's well-being. If anything, it was very stimulating for him to dominate the women. And there was a sexual component, even if the women were not sexually assaulted. But overall, this is the story of the book, The Autobiography of James Carnac. And the Autobiography of Jack the Ripper by James Carnac, excuse me, but it really is the same concept. This person named James Willoughby Carnac is claiming to have been Jack the Ripper and wrote a book-length explanation as to how and why he did it. I think that this is just a different moment in the Jack the Ripper saga, and this manuscript may have been written around 1928, 29, or 1930, and it seems like it was mostly hidden in the shadows for a very long time, and in 2012 it made a media splash for a little bit. The news articles that you heard were from 2012, and then people probably had the same response that I did. Well, that's kind of weird. It's kind of a weird story. Well, is it real? Is it fake? Probably fake. And they moved on. But I told you guys that I was going to be discussing some other sources here on this episode of Ripper Wednesday, and I was listening to the Ripper Cast, which is a podcast about Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders, and Paul Begg was also a guest on that program as well. And they were talking about the writer Patricia Cornwell, who's a very famous American novelist, and one of the panelists, who was not Paul Begg, brought up a point that what Patricia Cornwell did was unfair to the world of Ripperology. Because, firstly, she has multiple books out about her Jack the Ripper suspect, Walter Sickert. One of them is called Portrait of a Killer, and I have a standalone book discussion about that here on Ripper Wednesday on Black Box Online Radio. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. But also, she has another book out that has the subtitle, The Secret Life of Walter Sickert, and she has a very large audience. She's made an enormous amount of money from putting out these Jack the Ripper books, yet they are filled with errors and mistakes. And I agree completely. I mean, even somebody like me, who's a relative newcomer to the Jack the Ripper case, I mean, I've done Ripper Wednesday for 3 years, but as you guys know, I'm not a magnificent expert. I don't proclaim to be an expert on Jack the Ripper. I don't proclaim to be a Ripperologist. I'm somebody who's doing exactly what I did in this episode, looking at books, reading news articles, finding out, oh, these are different moments in the Jack the Ripper saga, just like anybody else. Patricia Cornwell not only put out her books, which are filled with errors, but she made an enormous amount of money from it. She would do interviews when she would talk down to other Ripperologists, but she didn't necessarily get the narrative right herself. And as somebody who has read her book, Portrait of a Killer, that is absolutely true. I even thought about making a follow-up, just with my own limited knowledge, highlighting all of the errors that are in Patricia Cornwell's book, Portrait of a Killer, mistakes and just misrepresentations, even things that she's recalling from her own experiences interacting with true crime cases that are also erroneous. So ultimately, I think that Patricia Cornwell should have done a better job. But in human terms, I recognize the difficulties in getting everything right. I make mistakes all the time here on Ripper Wednesday because the Jack the Ripper case is extremely intricate, it's extremely complicated, and especially when I did my recent Charles Lechmere episodes, a lot of you guys who know the case better than I do were very keen to point things out in the comments section about, oh, I'm making a mistake here and there, and I'm just thinking, all right, I accept it. So in that regard, I do have to give some human leeway to Patricia Cornwell, but she has a much bigger audience. She made a lot of money distributing her Jack the Ripper books. She may have even destroyed a Walter Sickert painting in the process, although she claimed that it was destroyed during the shipping to her for her investigation. So, the long and short of it is, she might have a much higher standard, or at the same time, I mean, I think that the amount of errors in her books is still inexcusable. But let me know what you think if you've read any of Patricia Cornwell's books, if you've read the one about The Secret Life of Walter Sickert or Portrait of a Killer. Please give your response in the comment section down below. And also, I would really just love to know, what do you think about the autobiography of Jack the Ripper? What do you think about anything that has been discussed on this episode? I would love to know your responses. Please share them in the comments section down below. And I will be with you guys tomorrow for a new episode about the Black Dahlia Thursday here on Black Box Online Radio. And this show comes to you Monday through Friday here on YouTube. You can also download the program for free on Spotify and Apple Podcasts under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. On Mondays, I talk about the Zodiac Killer. On Tuesdays, I will be launching a new segment about the disappearance of Maura Murray, which will come out starting next Tuesday. That will be a limited edition series here on Black Box Online Radio. On Wednesday, I talk about Jack the Ripper, of course, Dahlia Thursday, and on Fridays about D.B. Cooper. I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. My Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. My YouTube name is Black Box Online Radio, and Instagram, blackboxned88. So, lots of ways to keep in touch and lots of content out there. And if you want to support any of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And I'll see you guys tomorrow. Until next time.